Talking landscape photography with Christian Fletcher and Carwin.
G'day, it's Carwin and Christian Fletcher with you today. Now, a lot of times we get emails from listeners that want to just know basic composition tips. So let's get straight into it, Christian.
Time for the top 3 tips. To be sure.
Say that again, mate. We just couldn't understand your accent.
Time for the top 3 tips.
Christian, what are your top 3 tips for photographic composition?
3 tips. Now that's going to be that's difficult because there's so many more than 3 tips, and I've got a bit of an idea. I think it might run into 5 times that many tips. So let's get into it and talk about what makes a good composition. And I've talked to people before about this, and I've probably spoken to you about this. It's how difficult composition is, and how you can. How do you grasp composition? It's not a technical thing. Like, you can learn Photoshop, which is technical, and you can learn how to use your camera, which is technical. But when it comes to composition, it becomes subjective. So, how do you teach that?
A lot of people say too that you need to know some of the basic rules to break the rules. Now, a lot of guys like you, and I'm not looking at you in particular, but Tony Hewitt, blah blah blah, et cetera, don't really seem to use the compositional rules.
Yeah. Breaking the rules is always good. And I think when you have photographed enough, it becomes intuitive. You know this is the right composition. And once you know that, then you can, I guess, alter the rules and change the boundaries and push things to different, part of the thing is, where, you got that little rectangle that you're looking through, and where is that rectangle best placed to get the photo that you want. And that all comes down to what you're feeling and what you're thinking about that scene and what you want to say about that scene. So I mean, you've got all your basics, your rule of thirds, your leading lines, and your negative space, symmetry, all these things.
Yeah.
But there's so much more as well. I mean, there's the color composition, and there's the light, where it interacts with the landscape, the color of the light, highlights and shadows, all these things that come into play as well. Sorry, mate. Cut that bit out. So, all right. So, let's get back. Yeah, I was sort of waiting for you to go, oh, that's great, Christian. Elaborate.
Oh, that's great, Christian. Elaborate. Look, you're a starting out photographer. You've been, maybe shooting for a couple of years. How do you shoot a landscape? Like, just a beginner. Like, what advice would you give to them composition-wise?
Okay, well, let's go through it. Let's break it down. Let's make it as easy as possible. So, I've been doing it for 29 years now. So for me, I just get out and pick the camera up. I know how to use my camera, and I go to a scene and it looks right. But that doesn't help anyone if I say, you'll know because it'll look right. What is right? So, the first thing to think about is your compositional tools, like the rule of thirds. And that's all about where do you put the subject, where do you put the horizon, and I think most people know about the rule of thirds. In fact, you can turn on a guide in your camera to display the rule of thirds lines on your viewfinder, on your image, and that way that kind of helps you, with your composition. It helps you work out where those points are that are important to place your subject. So I use the rule of thirds a lot, and if you look back at your photographs and you think about them, you can actually see the rule of thirds working in a lot of your images. So things like where do you put your horizon is really important. So I look at the scene when I'm out there shooting a landscape. If there's a beautiful sky, I know that I probably want to include more of that sky. If it's not a great sky, I would probably, and the foreground's more interesting, I would add more of the foreground. So that's how I use the rule of thirds, pretty much for positioning the horizon. Very rarely do I put the horizon in the middle of the picture, but that's to say that you can't do that. And when you're shooting a panoramic, sort of a lot of the time, your horizons do end up close to the center because that's just the way of the format. I'm shooting more and more 2-to-1 ratios these days, which allows you to, have a bit more of a choice.
With panos, how do you compose that?
Yeah, well, panoramics are different because we don't see panoramics. We don't see in panoramic, but they are a beautiful way to show off a landscape because you seem to have more, width. Generally, you do have more width in the image, and you don't have as much foreground and sky, and that is nice because a lot of the time when you see a rectangular image or a square image, if the foreground's not so interesting, it takes away from that composition. So panoramics are, when I was shooting panoramics with my Fuji camera, I had a viewfinder and I could disconnect that from the camera and I can use that and I could look through that and I could see where the panoramic was going to be. And that was a great way of, finding a composition. What people do these days, which I learnt, I only learnt just recently, is when I was hanging out with a couple of the UK photographers, Steve Gosling and Joe Cornish, they were using their phones before they'd even considered pulling their cameras out of the bag. So a lot of the time they were just taking photographs with their phones and going, okay, is that the composition? And you need to do that because quite often your eye, if you're looking with your eye or looking through the viewfinder, there's always seems to be there's a distraction. But once you get an image on a screen, you can actually see what that composition is and how you can change it to make it better. It seems almost like because it becomes a two-dimensional object, it changes your perception of that scene. So when you're looking at it with your eye, it's three-dimensional. As soon as you shoot it with the phone and you see it on the screen of the phone, it's a two-dimensional object. And that helps your composition. So what I used to do, obviously, was with the viewfinder, take it off from the camera, and I can walk around and look through, and that helped. And now, you can use your phone to work out what your composition is going to be. So, other things that are important with composition are the leading lines, and everyone knows the classic railway line, where you've got the tracks coming from the outside of the frame and converging at a point somewhere in the middle of the image. Now, those leading lines don't necessarily have to be symmetrical. You can have them coming out from one side and going across to some point in the horizon on the left or the right, but not necessarily in the center. So there's all those sort of things that come into play. You go to a farm and you'll see fence posts leading off into the distance. Those things just help to cement your composition and give you that sense of depth, which always is what we're always trying to do with a photograph. It's because it's two-dimensional. We want to try and bring that illusion of depth into the image. So we want those leading lines. That helps with that sort of stuff. Of course, there's other things that come into play. One thing that I really like is negative space. And a lot of times I will photograph a scene if there's a really simple minimalist scene. I like to include a really huge amount of negative space. So that could be the sky is the classic example. And there's a point where if, let's say, you're out in the wheat belt and I'm heading out to the wheat belt on Thursday with Nick Rains, we're going to do some stuff out there, and there's nothing much out there to shoot. So generally it's about the sky and the scale. And when I'm out in those places, I look at a tree, like let's say a single tree, a classic cliche shot, single tree on a horizon. But there's a point where that tree, that composition will look better depending on how close you are to it or how far away, and then how much sky you include. By having something as like a tree that is generally quite tall and big, but that being very small in the composition on a right in the distance on a flat horizon with this massive sky, it has this sense of scale. So that's a really nice way to compose those sort of images using that negative space.
Just on trees, I've noticed recently there's quite a few people going to New Zealand, to Wanaka, to photograph the Wanaka tree, and all the shots look the same. What can we do differently so you just don't end up with exactly the same shot as everybody else shooting that thing? And have you shot it?
No, I haven't, but I do believe someone went there with a chainsaw one day, and I think they were thinking about cutting it down.
Yeah, that's good.
Imagine that. It'd be an outrage. But apparently, I was in New Zealand in April last year on a tour, and I was with Joe Cornish and Steve Gosling, and they both said, look, if we can avoid going to that tree, that would be fantastic. I think Steve actually went and photographed it earlier before the tour, and he said there were people just all hassling over this one tree. And look at it, and it is stunning. It looks great. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's
but when there's 600 people, they're all trying to get this photograph. It's just like, hey, how about that photo? Did you see that photo of Mount Everest with all those people climbing up? Did you see that one?
Yeah, I saw that.
I thought that was fake. And in this day and age where you can't believe anything from anyone,
That's quite true. Yeah,
definitely anything you see on Facebook. I saw that photo. I thought that's fake. That someone's just composited a whole bunch of people in there. That's not real. And then I found out it was real. It was unbelievable. But that's what we do as humans. We just find out what's good, and we all want it. We all want that trophy. We all want to climb Everest. We want to get a shot of the Wanaka Tree and Sugarloaf Rock and all these cliched things that we just sort of cling onto. I don't know why we do that. And searching for a composition that no one else has got, that's the aim for me. That's my mecca. I don't want to go to the Wanaka Tree and photograph it because everyone else has done it and they'll probably have done it better. So what's the point? I'll go find something else. And there was a talk that Nick Rains does, and it's about a photographer. I can't remember his name now, and he likes to photograph macro images because there's more chance that you'll get your own unique viewpoint because it's this tiny little macro world, and it's unique, and it's generally going to be more unique to you, not to someone else. So yeah, that's all part of it. And look, if I was to photograph the Wanaka Tree, I would photograph it from a distance with a little bit of water, the tree very small in the frame, but with a massive sky, and make it a big square, and I'd probably desaturate it and make it all very contemporary and light. But of course, I'd have to photograph 600 photographers out of that, Photoshop 600 photographers out of the shot first if I'm going to stand that far back.
You've been to the United States. You've been to Yosemite. Tell us what it's like shooting at Yosemite.
Well, the good thing about when I was shooting Yosemite, it was 20 years ago. Yeah, 19 years ago. So photography this was before digital, and most people, everyone was using film. Yeah, there was pretty much no digital cameras. And I was using, the best thing about that, I would go to a site and there was some people photographing, you'd see these guys, but they all had their little SLRs, not DSLRs obviously, because they're film. And I had a Fuji GX 617, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen one of those, but it's a massive, big thing. It's I don't know, it's like imagine your keyboard, if you got your Apple keyboard and you put a lens on the front of it and put that on a tripod, it was that big. It was a monster. It had these big handrails that went around the lens that kind of protected, they were like roll bars, I guess, for the lens. And I would just put that out next to the guys with their SLRs, and they'd all just disappear because they go,
intimidating.
This guy's got he's got a big one. Let's get out of here. And I went everywhere in the States and didn't see hardly anyone because it wasn't so popular. Now DSLRs, everyone's a photographer, everyone wants those trophy shots. That everyone's running tours, and it's just, there's nothing wrong with that, and I'm not knocking it. I think that's great. Everyone wants to get into it because it's great fun, and why wouldn't you? I mean, we love photography and we love to shoot, and it's great to go with your friends and find these places, or not find them, but go get the trophies. I mean, it's like going to Africa and finding some lions to shoot, with your camera, obviously. But there's some people that like to use guns as well and hang the head of the lion on their mantelpiece above the fire so that they can prove what a big man they are.
Yep.
Or a big woman, but we won't go down that. We won't get too political about that stuff. We'll just stick to photography. But yeah, America wasn't a problem when I was there. It was good. But I've been there recently. The last 2 trips I've done, we have gone to some iconic places, but we've managed to avoid most of the crowds, which is great. And a lot of the stuff that I like to photograph in America now is that urban banal stuff. So I like the crappy towns where if you're seen with a camera in town, people are wondering what you're doing, as opposed to, there's another photographer, like, what's he spying on, and why is he shooting it's, so yeah, you've got to be a little bit careful. But that's another podcast topic, and it's the drive-by shooting podcast that we should do. Talk about that, because that's great fun. That's
drive-by shooting with a camera, of course, though, Christian.
Yeah, of course, but that's my preferred shooting method these days. So it's very nice. But yeah, look, we should get back into the whole composition thing, shouldn't we? We got a little bit sidetracked, but that's okay. So so we talked about negative space and asymmetrical compositions. An asymmetrical composition is obviously one where you might have a mountain coming down on the left into a river or a lake, and then on the right there's a huge amount of space with nothing in it. That means you have your negative space, but you've got this asymmetrical composition, and they can still look balanced and nice.
Some people are scared of negative space, and I've always learnt off the masters, to really think about your negative space and what's happening there. But you're not afraid of it? No,
it's good. Yeah, it's great because there's less to think about, and that's it makes it more minimal, and the more simple the image, the better. Like I saw an image on Instagram the other day, which I really loved, and it was a sign. It was a street sign, and it was. The photographer had lined it up on the edge of this yellow building, and on the other side was the blue sky. So there was basically two squares, two rectangles, one yellow, one blue, and in between, right in the intersection and right in the middle of the frame was this red, I think it was a stop sign, or it might have been some other sort of sign, but it was red and white with this pole, and it was all lined up perfectly, and it was so simple, so effective. I thought, I love that. And they're the sort of things that I like. I mean, that's talking about a symmetrical composition. And I really love symmetrical compositions as well, because I love to see a tree in the middle of the frame, a tower or a building, things lining up. Or if you're shooting at a lake and you've got trees on the lake, and then there's a beautiful symmetrical mirror reflection of the trees in the lake, that sort of stuff always is pleasing to the eye, and I love shooting that sort of stuff. We've talked about where to position the subject in your frame, but there's other things that are good and help your composition, things like patterns and shapes. So, that can be a pattern in nature or a man-made shape or that sort of stuff. Those things are really important as well. If you've got a pattern that is recurring through the image, definitely it's more relevant to architectural photography, perhaps. But there is symmetry and patterns and shapes in nature that you can use to your advantage.
Oh no! Keep going with that. That was good. Sorry, I was just when you finished, I was gonna chuck something in.
Oh, okay.
I'll cut this out.
I'm actually a little bit, patterns. Well, shapes are definitely important, and one thing that I like to think about is the triangular shapes. So, whenever I'm out photographing the bush and there's trees, I'm always looking for a tree that is the tallest in the scene, and then I want two other trees on either side, and one is going to be smaller and one's going to be even smaller again, so that you've got these three trees that are all different sizes, and you want the biggest one in the middle, so you get that nice full effect. So again, you can draw sort of triangles. The tree can be a triangle itself, and then the combination of the three trees together create one big triangle. So triangle shapes in your image is really, really important. The roofs of houses and stuff like that, buildings. I always like to put the weight of those triangles towards the center of the image and have everything sort of fall off to the sides. You can bring the triangle to like an asymmetrical composition where the triangle might be off to the side a little bit more, and then you have the smaller triangles down on the right or left or wherever you want to, and that does give you the asymmetrical composition.
Now, if you listen to guys like Nick Rains, he talks about when he does his Leica Academy courses, he talks about people understanding their cameras, so knowing how they work inside and out, and then worrying about the composition. I mean, that's very true. Like, you've got to know how to use your camera, and then, I mean, the first thing when you go to a shoot is actually putting the composition together in your mind.
Yeah.
In your opinion, Fletch, like, do you get to the point where you don't even have to think mechanically about the composition, where you are actually shooting from the soul, and the composition just comes to you? Like, you're naturally drawn to the composition?
Yeah. Look, it definitely has. That's how I work now, because you've done it so much. You go out, you've made the mistakes, and you can identify them. So when I go out now, look, I don't get it right all the time, and the problem with shooting digital is that you will just take chances on a composition. You go, oh, it's not quite right, but bang, I'm going to shoot it, because you never know, it might get back, and I might be able to crop it a certain way, or I might be able to change something here or there. So in the early days, I learned to compose better because it was costing me $5 every time I pushed the button. And being a struggling photographer, 4 shots is $20. I mean, actually, if you spoke to any photographer now and said, I'm going to charge you $5 every time you push the button, people would definitely get their compositions nailed a lot quicker.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that taught me. And I quite often will go out and not even take a photo because I just couldn't find that composition, and I didn't want to waste that money. And it is a waste, but that's a great way to be taught. I'm talking film and processing. That I live down south, so to get my trannies developed, I'd have to send them off to Perth, and that would take a week to get them there and back. And so there was nothing instant. You didn't learn about your composition that quickly. So it took years and years and years to work it out. And now I'm at a point where I can go to the beach and go, that's a good composition, that's not a good composition. But yeah, like it's not always intuitive. But once you've got these little things in your head about your rule of thirds and leading lines, symmetry, patterns, shapes, all that sort of stuff, that helps what you're doing. And once you've got where to basically put your subject in that frame, there's other things to consider, like the position of the light and the quality of the light and how that light interacts with the landscape. Where, if you're photographing a scene, do you position your subject so that you're looking into the sun, or 45 degrees to the sun, 90 degrees to the sun, or do you want the sun to be completely directly behind you and shoot 180 degrees to the sun? All those things come into your composition as well. So that's another thing that can change your composition, like the quality of light and how that it does interact with the landscape. If you think about light falling on a subject, so here you've got a row of trees, big poplar trees, they're autumn colours, it's beautiful. You've got they're leading this line, it's going to the horizon, and you can see all these trees just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That's one composition. But then you've got the shadows are doing the same thing, and then that's symmetrical, but it's also without that light, without those harsh shadows coming across, your composition is going to be completely different. It's going to have a different look. So the way that the shadows and the highlights interact in your landscape and in your composition makes a difference to the final result as well. So it's a bit like, you imagine a shadow being like a reflection in some respects. It does reflect. It's not reflecting the light, but its shape is altering the light. So they're things to think about as well. And that quality of light. If you're going out on a beautiful morning, sunrise morning, and that you're going to get that beautiful golden glow, or you go out and there's no golden glow and it's all just grey and overcast. What things will alter your composition, and what things are important? How will you decide what to frame and where, depending on how that light's falling on that subject? So there's a few considerations like that as well. Things that I like to look for are bright colours and in a low colour background. So you can imagine you photograph a street sign that's bright red and yellow, say bright red and yellow with black, and then your background is a really dark grey or a black. So you've got these really bright colours that stand out, and dull colours behind it that don't stand out. And it's the same thing with tone, so and highlights and shadows. So if you imagine an image where the brightest highlights are very minimal in the image. The majority of the image is dark, really dark shadows, dark light, dark mid-tones. But then you've got these really bright highlights. So imagine, think about a tree, a white poplar tree. in a field or on the side of a mountain, the whole mountain, the background is completely dark and grey, and you still got shape and form there, but there's these highlights become really important. It's like sand dunes. Think about photographing in a sand dune, and the light is just touching the very top of that sand dune, but everything else is a really dark grey. Those things are really important. The other thing is also you think about photographing in the snow in, say, Japan, where everything is white, but then you have this really dark tree or dark subject or a line, a fence line. So the majority of the image is white or really bright highlights, but you have these really one small area of dark shadows. So these are other things that really look good in compositions. And, if you can change your viewpoint to isolate them, to make that really bright highlight stand out more against a really dark background, that's important. And likewise, there's your really dark tree against a white snowy mountain or field.
It's interesting you say that. Julianne Cost, who we've spoken to previously, who is the post-production queen, actually a good photographer in her own right too. She's been posting some stuff on Instagram in Iceland, and she's got a background in psychology, so this makes complete sense. But she calls it the Rorschach test, which is, of course, when you've got psychological issues, which we all do, and your doctor shows you a squiggle on a piece of paper, and you've got to interpret it. But she takes these shots, and I'm actually looking at her Instagram account right now, and we'll put this on our Instagram too, so you can reference it. But there's a shot of a polar bear. I can see a polar bear. I can also see a lion. I can see a dinosaur, and I can see a household cat. Now, I'm just wondering, has she actually seen that composition when she shot it and thought, I can get something out of that, or is that just happened? When you're composing, do you ever look for shapes that resemble other things in your shots?
Yeah, well, I think that every now and then you have one of those moments where it's like, oh no, seriously, that can't be true. Look at that. Look at how that mimics that, and how's that? Look at how that shadow looks like one of those things, and that. And there's signs that say, whatever, that there's this kind of this weirdness and this strange idea going on, and it's like, how did that get put together? That happens every now and then, not always, but when you do get that, it's it's pretty exciting.
Pemberton, the big public pool they've got down in Pemberton.
Yeah.
There's and the carry trees are in the background. I did I was attempting to shoot a pano there with I think 4 or 5 different shots, and it didn't really work. The light wasn't any good or anything like that. So I got back to the studio, and I started playing around with the images, and I turned one of them up on its side. So
yep.
And then all of a sudden this the reflection in the water and the carry trees all of a sudden turned on their side. It looked like a killer wasp with these huge sort of evil eyes and tentacles coming off it, and the body and that sort of stuff. And I'm just thinking, on location, there is no way possible you could actually see that. It's just, sometimes it's amazing when you turn this shot around. It's amazing what you can actually see in it. It was weird.
Yeah. That's interesting. It reminds me of a photograph I took up at Karajini, and I made it into a black and white, but it was one of the little water holes there, and there was a tree that was sort of bent. It came up and it sort of bent around, and it had another branch coming off on a funny angle. And when you looked at the photo in the reflection in the water, it actually looked like a fish, and the branch coming off looked like a fin.
Right.
And you look at it and go, okay, so this is about water, and there are fish in there, but this composition that I didn't even think about at first when I got back and started editing it, and especially when I changed it to black and white, so you're just looking at the tones, there was a fish that formed this fish shape, and that's all just because of this symmetry. So that's interesting. So those things do come, they do happen, and you're lucky when you get something like that. So I like that those sort of things, those sort of compositions, but they're few and far between, unfortunately. Maybe that's fortunate, because then they're more special.
like this image in Pemberton. I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, how did I? That's honestly.
Killer wasp.
It was. I will post it on our Instagram, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But it was truly evil. Now, a lot of people say too that with your compositions, once you take the shot, once you get it back to your studio or back on your Mac or wherever you do your post-production, is to let it breathe, because sometimes other compositions within the composition can present themselves. Do you do that? Do you sometimes? Because I know Ken Duncan, sometimes he'll go on a shoot and he'll wait a couple of weeks before he actually processes any images, just to let them breathe.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. What's the best thing you can do is actually make a print of an image and then sit back, and then it doesn't take initially, like everything that you do and that we do in life is initially things seem so much better. I'm watching House Rules at the moment with my wife, and people walk into the room and they're like, "Oh my God, I don't believe that's amazing.
Look
it's
what
fantastic."
You've done with that splashback.
And they go,
it's incredible.
Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. That's amazing. And then they sit down, and about 10 minutes later, they start going, "Oh, I don't know about that colour, or that rug doesn't seem to go."
Yep.
So it's the same with photos. If you put it up, and I've made this mistake plenty of times. So I get this image, and I think it's fantastic, and I'll make a print of it, and I'll send it to the girls and say, "Right, okay, let's get this framed and let's hang it in the gallery." And then once it comes back framed after a month or so, I'm looking to go, I don't know why we framed that one up. It's not so great. So, yeah, letting it breathe is definitely good advice. You make the print, stick it to your wall somewhere and look at it. And if you like it in 6 months' time, then you probably got something. You've got a winner. So, yeah, definitely a good way of, things. And the other thing I think about a lot, and I got this from Tony Hewitt, actually. He says, look at the edges of your composition. What's happening on the edges of the frame? And so when you're looking through your viewfinder, you can do that then in camera. So you're looking at that little rectangle, but you're looking at it each corner and each edge and going, okay, what's coming in and what's coming out, what should stay there, what should be deleted. So some of that you can delete in post if you have to, but a lot of the time, if you make your composition, just change a little bit. If there's a bit of a tree or a bit of a hill that's coming into the bottom, right-hand corner, third of the way up, and it's not helping your composition, really look at that. So what we do when we look through our viewfinders with our camera is we tend to just look at what's going on in the middle, and it doesn't always work. And I know when I'm photographing people, because I'm the worst portrait photographer, is I'll always put their face right in the middle of the frame. Yeah. And then I get after to go, oh, hang on, why is there so much headroom? Why didn't I change my compositions? Because you don't look through the viewfinder so much as you probably should. So you really need to study the whole thing. So when you're looking through that camera, you're going, okay, that's what's happening in the middle, but what's happening on those edges there? So that's another thing that I think helps your composition out. Of course, the last thing that I'm thinking of now is your focal length. So there's your scene, do you choose a wide angle lens? Do you use a long tele or short tele, or do you use a standard focal length? And all those things will affect your composition hugely. It's amazing. Like a lot of the times when I'm shooting landscapes, I love shooting with a really wide angle lens, because that just brings your foreground out. It just allows you to open up the foreground and to create this beautiful composition, getting close to a subject. I got one image that I really liked, which was of a rock on the beach at Cape Naturalist. It had been sort of exposed, but it wasn't very big. It was probably about the height of your waist, I guess. So it's not a massive rock, but I got in with a wide angle and I got really, really close to it. And I focus stacked because I knew that I was going to have to get the foreground and the background to be nice and sharp. And this rock looked huge. It looks way bigger than what it was. You can't do that with any other focal length. That wide angle allows you to get in close and make the foreground really come alive and be big and epic and interesting. And then mountains. You photograph a mountain with a wide angle lens, and it's just going to look insignificant, and even to your eye, the mountains look great, but as soon as you shoot it with a wide angle, it compresses everything down to the horizon. It all gets flat, and so that's when you would change to a longer focal length. And maybe if you wanted to include more of the scene, you just stitch a whole lot together, and then that's a way of changing that composition as well. So yeah.
I wonder if it sometimes helps before you take the shot to have a crop in mind. So you might go out to a location and sort of go, if it's Sugarloaf Rock, for instance, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to shoot a 3-to-1, which is a pano, or I'm going to go out there and try and do a 1-to-1 shot. Do you think having that mindset helps you set your composition as well?
Yeah, I think if you just remember to do those things, I think it's important, because a lot of the time you get out there and the light it's happening. You got 15 minutes really to get the shots and the angles. So having a bit of an idea of what you want to do, or even having a checklist of, okay, have I got my leading lines? Have I got my negative space? Have I got the crops that I want? Do I want to do a pano, square? Do I want to do a rectangle? Do I want to do a 2-to-1? How's the light looking? What's it falling on? What's my color composition doing? Are there any shapes? Is there any repetition? Do I want symmetrical, asymmetrical? So if you could work through all that stuff in your head while you're there and get it done quickly, you can get some shots. But I like to race around. I can't stand just going to one location and finding one angle and then shooting that until the sun goes down. I feel like I wasted the time, which I probably shouldn't, because you should slow down and perfect that one thing. But I jump around all over the place. I'm all over the rocks and moving around pretty quickly, just trying to maximize that light. It's a shame that it's not like over in Norway in summer, where you've got all day to compose and get your shots. It just doesn't happen like that over in Australia. You know what it's like. You
have to work hard for them.
I mean, winter's a bit better, but summer, man, here comes the light. Look at that! Wow! Oh, there it goes.
Oh, it's terrible. And the worst thing about summer too is you have to get up at obscene o'clock in the morning. Like, you have to be up at 4 for sunrise. I hate it.
Yeah, that's a problem with landscape photography. But look, I think if people think about all those things we've talked about, that will definitely help them when they go out to shoot next. Mind you, there's a lot to think about, so you've got to keep reminding yourself about those things, and to a point where you don't have to go back to your notes to work out what it is I need to do to make a better composition. Once you start getting all these things in, and then you'll see it eventually. It's all about shooting, and more shooting. It's like I was watching MasterChef last night. Look at this, I'm going through all these.
You watched some great TV, mate.
Reality shows, but I mean, I like MasterChef because I like cooking.
I was on Neighbours last night, incidentally. Did you watch Neighbours?
No, Neighbours. But in MasterChef, they had a guy on there who was showing him how to make dumplings. And I don't know how many dumplings, he'd been doing it for 10 years, but I don't know how many, he makes 1,000 dumplings a day or something like that. And the way his hands move, the way he could move that dough around and create this perfectly shaped, and these dumplings were all the same size, they're all consistent. That's exactly what we're talking about. It's all about getting out there, and having done it so many times, exactly where that's the shot, that's the angle I'm going to do, that's the crop I'm going to create, and it all becomes automatic.
And I guess finally too, take the pressure off yourself as well. Like at the day's end, if you're an amateur, there's not sheep stations riding on the thing. Have fun and let the composition and light come to you and enjoy it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a bit harder for me because I go out to take photos, and the girls and the gallery are saying, well, where's these shots? What did you get? Oh, the light was no good. What do you mean the light was no good? Oh, I didn't get the composition. What do you mean you didn't? So yeah, it is sheep stations for me when I go out there.
Yeah. You're not fluffing around. Christian, thanks very much for that, mate. That was a really informative podcast, but just some takeaways we can get from this today.
Yeah, so the thing that's really important is that you go out and you have the fun. You're going to make photographs that are for you. It's not important if everyone else likes it. You don't have to put it on Facebook or Instagram and get all these likes. It's about you. You're the one who has to like that photograph, because in the end it's all subjective. And if you take photographs to get likes, you're just going to end up bitter and twisted. And photographing the landscape, it's all about you and what you want to do and what you want, your vision. So go out and enjoy it.
Thanks, Fletch. And if you like the show today, make sure you subscribe and leave a review. Hopefully a good one, and give us a 5-star rating On iTunes, if you'd like to send us an email, our email address is lightminded617@gmail.com. So you might want to send us some of your photos and we can have a chat about them as well. And check us out on Instagram, Light Minded Podcast. Just do a search for that. We'll be back soon.
Talking landscape photography with Kristen Fletcher and Cowan.